As you guys know, brewing coffee is very difficult, and you just need to pour water on it, and things are usually good. Okay, so generally speaking, say Aeropress in their cafe, and also if you're doing it at home, is you want an Aeropress clear, or any of them nowadays. I like clear because it's Triton, it holds heat a little bit better. And you need a flow control cap, Prismo. The dose, which you can adjust depending on how you want your coffee to be extracted, is going to be around 14 to 15 grams. I believe in their cafe it is 14 grams. You are pouring 240 to 250 mils. The reason why you lower the dose here is that you are limited in space with how much water you can add into the Aeropress. Now, again, this also depends on what roast level and whatever you're doing. But the thing is you're grinding very, very fine, and you're going to let it steep for 5 minutes, and then you plunge. So that's what they do in their cafe. And they're using a tone brewer that shoots boiling water into here, and it does pretty good agitation and saturation of the bed. If you're doing it at home, you can manually swirl. You can also be a little more meticulous. You also can steep longer. However, I think this really depends on what burst sets you're using and whatnot. They're using well-aligned 98 EK in their shop, I believe, with SSP brew bursts. If you have a very expressive coffee, it should stand out in something like Aeropress, but have the nice body, nice sweetness. Water temperature, by the way, use 100 Celsius, and you're just gonna pour like this. And that's going to do a lot of that agitation for you. Depending on kettle, the more agitation you do, the general experience I have had is a more vibrancy at the beginning. And what you do is you get a little thing to just cover the Aeropress to help retain the temperature. So I'm going to go get a little cup for that. So you can use a small mug, or this is like an IKEA mug. As long as you cover the Aeropress like this, it should be good. Got this all set up. Take your 14 grams or 15 grams. You can also, again, up dose between each of these depending on ratios. Pour this in here, and then we're going to give it a little bit of a level. So the thing with this is we're pushing for high extractions, so you just need to be careful. This really depends on coffee and also burst set. You also can manipulate this based on how long you steep. But generally speaking, I think you should start with 240 mils. So 14 to 240, get to 1 to 17, you let it steep for 5 minutes, you taste it. If the issue with some of the high extraction Aeropress recipes is that things can end up tasting very, very thin. And this happens, you can totally observe this when you push things into 1 to 18 world. Although fitting 250 in here is a little rough. I also, for many burr sets, I would not recommend you push above 1 to 17. It might taste incredibly thin. It might taste very ashy. And the thing is you're tasting high extraction, but some of these burr sets don't necessarily handle very well with super, super high extraction. So I just, be aware of that. And that's the thing that a lot of people always are chasing, like, oh, I want to extract high, extract high, extract high. It works with some grinders and some burst sets. It doesn't work with everything, and it doesn't work for every single coffee. Just be aware of that. But anyway, here is 14 grams. Give it a little bit of a level. And then what I'm going to do is I have boiling water, 100 Celsius here. Let me zoom you guys in. And I'm just going to pour to 240, and I'm just going to cap it off. So that is how it is. I can begin the timer. I'm pouring very aggressively. You can do a little bit of spinning, but this initial agitation is very helpful. I went a little over 244. That's completely fine. And 240 to 250 for this coffee for say, for a lot of these coffees is quite helpful. And then, just cap it off and you let it sit for 5 minutes. So that is all you do. Very, very hard. At 5 minutes, or, I would say 4:30, 4:45, you can begin plunging. And plunge at a very constant, slow-ish rate. And that is how you do it. And I'll taste this, and I'll tell you guys about what kind of optimizations you can do. But pretty much because they're doing stuff in a cafe, they can't be agitating the thing all the time, right? So the initial agitation does, in my opinion, a really, really great job at saturating everything. What you will find, though, is if you do observe the grounds, you will see that they'll kind of be up here, suspended up here. If you do want to, resaturate them, you can spin the Aeropress a little, and you theoretically will get a better extraction. But this is, for simplicity purposes, a very, very good recipe, a very good starting point for a lot of the SEY coffees. What I will say, though, is, and I'll talk about it with tasting, is high extraction is not necessarily gonna be the best. This is kind of why I've kind of fallen out of favor with some of these recipes, especially in these upper bounds of 1:17 to 1:18 ratio, is that when you are pushing coffees this hard, it is highly dependent on the grinder, but more so with the coffee and the roasting style, where things are tasting so thin because you've stretched them out so much, and you end up with gear, or you end up with coffee that just can't handle it that well. So that's why I start with 5 minutes and see. I have found that if you let this steep past 7 minutes, that's when in my opinion, you've extracted too much, and things can really start to taste very bitter, very thin, very weird. And that's the advantage of doing the steeping thing is just, if you keep everything else the same or very similar, steep it for the same amount of time, or you can steep it longer or less time. But I think this is a good starting point. 14, 240, 245, 250, total ratio, 5 minutes off the boil, pour at a relatively constant speed, and then plunge at a very constant speed. And this will get you in the ballpark of what these coffees will be tasting like in their cafe, especially, depending on what gear you're using. Some adjustments, since we're letting this steep, is the initial agitation that you pour the water in. I have found that if you have a faster flowing kettle than something like that Stag, Brewista, or you can go in and manually agitate, you'll find a more apparent upfront acidity. But generally speaking, because it's an Aeropress, it's going to be very balanced, very sweet, very, forgiving, as we'd say. So that is the recipe. You can definitely see the fines, or a lot of things will move around, but I don't really think you need to worry about that too much, right? You're starting with this, just see how it tastes before you analyze and look at the visuals and whatever, right? Just taste the coffee first and then see if you like it or not. Almost 5 minutes. I would say depending on what you are tasting, 4:30 to 4:45, you could start plunging, but I'm going to take this off so you guys can see. You'll probably see that the coffees have migrated to the top there. If you did want to agitate initially, this will reincorporate everything, but I have found to not care too much, and things will taste pretty decent. And at 5 minutes, we're going to go in, and we're going to plunge. I'm plunging at a pretty constant rate. Around 30-ish seconds. But you can kind of see I'm just kind of leaning on the Aeropress, and I'm pushing the water through, or the brewed coffee through. Of course, resistance and all that is going to depend on how fine you're grinding, but grinding decently fine. My total is done at around 540-ish. So there you go. Because this is the flow control cap, very easy to clean up. And there you go. This is an immersion brew, if you can see, right? It's definitely visually thicker. It's going to have more body. Like look at how that looks when you pour it. Let me give this a taste and I'll tell you guys about some adjustments you can do. But generally speaking, with SEY coffees, you want to let them cool until a little bit above room temperature, like ever so slightly above room temperature. That's when I think they taste the best. Give it a taste. And then we can look at this Aeropress puck. This should knock out pretty easily because you have the filter. See, you got the filter. Then if I push this up a little, you can see this will come out very easily. It's very hot right now, but you'll get, you're not going to see any cracks. You're not going to see any like weirdness. If you see cracks, I think you're grinding a little too fine, or your grinder is creating a lot of fines. And yeah, so this is like a quote unquote evenly extracted Aeropress. You will see fine because we didn't agitate and reincorporate stuff. You will just see like kind of layers. Like you will see some fines in certain places. Let me taste this now, and I'll tell you guys about some slight optimizations that you can do. The first thing again is let the SEY coffees cool. Let them cool until they're just above room temperature. I've been very 50-50 on this style of brewing because I do think that it is a little too dependent on ratios and the coffee itself. Is that some of the SEY coffees are really great 1 to 18. 1 to, you can only fit so much water in the Aeropress. But I've generally started to just do 1 to 17s, 14 to 240, or even 245, because it's a lot easier to pour in the Aeropress. And then second of all, I feel that in the 18 to 18 and a half, 19 ratios, just in general, things can be just a little too thin, a little too muddy. And that's the nature of high extraction. But if we did this right, which I think I'm smelling it, it's smelling great. Yep, this is really nice. There's this acidity that is ever so up here, and then the rest of it is like, well, we'll do the other way. Acidity up here, and then it kind of smoothly finishes into that really nice, balanced, sweet Aeropress flavor profile that everybody likes, which is, immersion, right? If you wanted to make the acidity peak more, what you could do is you could do initial agitation more. You could also go in and, of course, manually agitate, right? At the end there, halfway through, at 2.5 minutes, I could have just swirled it a little bit more. But for simplicity's sake, and for, they're in a cafe and you just want to do something that's dumb easy, just pour the water in, cap it off, and don't think about it. And let the coffees cool, let the coffees shine, and it'll probably taste pretty good. But we're going to let this really cool down. The thing with the SEY coffees and just with this brew style is that you are trying to brew in a relatively transparent way, and you're trying to let the dynamics happen because of the coffee. Of course, you can influence dynamics by pouring the water in faster, but you're hoping that the coffee is dynamic itself or expressive itself, so that your brew tastes dynamic and expressive. So this is a little bit different than something like, say, my high agitation V60 SEY recipe, where I'm like agitating the hell out of it, or something like very, very aggressive agitation in an Aeropress. But this is like a incredibly strong baseline recipe. Super simple. I mean, this is really nice. Very nice crisp acidity in the front, but the rest of it is all that enjoyable body, sweetness. And this is also churroso. Well, this specific coffee we're brewing is a churroso. So what you should look for in this is, are you getting initial information about the coffee in some form of acidity as that coffee really, really cools? But I would say like it's really 30 to 40% acidity. The rest of it is body and sweetness. And that's just because of the Aeropress. And you can get more of that acidity in the cup if you agitate a little bit harder. But generally speaking, if you're serving these coffees to friends and family and you're running a cafe, right, you don't want to be serving battery acid. You want to be serving something that is honoring the coffee in this sense, right? You're honoring the coffee, but overall still focuses on enjoyability. And that's why those recipes are very nice. It's very straightforward. That is how you do a SEY Aeropress. Well, that's how I brew SEY Aeropress. And there you go. But yeah, as it really cools down, what's going to happen is you're going to get a peak of acidity, and the rest of it's going to be body and sweetness. And it's going to have that really nice immersion coffee taste. But if you wanted just more intensity in general, you could, of course, steep it longer. This grind size is actually slightly finer than pour over. Because you're running a flow control cap, you can just let it steep longer. So if you accidentally grind too coarse, just let it steep longer. And generally speaking, things will be fine. But eventually, this is the part of dialing in, is that eventually you'll find a point where you're grinding too fine. And I kind of always observe that with the pucks in here being too weird looking. And second of all, when you are starting to push the higher extractions, you taste weirdness. You taste like bitters in the back, or you taste, channeling of Aeropress. I like to go ever so slightly coarser just for range, right? You can save being too coarse with Aeropress a bit easier with the setup than being too fine, because when you plunge, you can just plunge slower, or you can steep longer. If it's too fine, plunging becomes a little difficult. So those are some like ever so slight optimizations. Yep, acidity starting to pop, but the rest of it, the finish, the mid palate and the finish, is really sweet, really approachable, lingers, very tasty, and that's kind of how you can tell is that acidity popping? If once it's really cooled down, if the acidity pops and the rest of it, you're not tasting any off flavors, that's how you know you're in the right direction, and you can now optimize based on steep time, as grind size, and also that initial agitation. So yeah, that's Aeropress. How to Aeropress.